Welcome, everyone. I know we still have folks joining, so we're going to start off a little gradually here. I'm so excited you could join us for our discussion of disability accommodations in college. We have a great group of panelists, and I've really been looking forward to this conversation. I'm just putting in the chat. We'd love to know where you're joining from. What's your role? Are you a parent, counselor, tutor, other type of professional? And what would you like to learn from the panelists? So put your questions in the chat and we will get to them. We're going to have a few slides, have people introduce ourselves, and then jump into the conversation. That QR code on the first slide is a link to Top College Consultants. Again, let us know in the chat, where are you joining from? What's your role? What do you want to learn from our panelists? What questions do you have for us? And this QR code is for the slides. So there's not a whole lot of slides, but we do have some resources at the end. So feel free to take a picture and I can come back to this slide later if you didn't get it. So again, I'm Eric Endlick. I'm a psychologist and founder of Top College Consultants, and our group of consultants around the country works with students around the country on the entire college application process, particularly students with learning differences and other diagnoses. With every aspect of the process, that's building a college list, getting the essays done, filling out the Common App, the UC app, whatever other platforms are involved, and helping with various decisions like choosing gap year programs, summer programs, figuring out what students need to do to become ready for college, getting set up for accommodations in college, figuring out where students can thrive financially when applying to college, and so on. And I'm joined by my illustrious team member, Jennifer Quinn, who's helping out with monitoring the chat and so on. Hey, Praveen, I'm in Walnut Creek too, so welcome. And that is a picture of an actual student. I did not use AI to create that. So let's jump in and introduce our panelists. This is their contact information. If you did see that QR code, then you'll have access to this slide and the links as well. And I can always jump back and put the slides back up if needed. Why don't we start with Annie?
Sure. Hey, everybody. I'm really excited to be here tonight. I'm also going to throw my social media accounts in the chat as well. It's Accessible College on Facebook and on Instagram. And at Accessible College, I support students with physical disabilities, so wheelchair users, mobility device users, students with visual impairments, hearing impairments, blindness, and also students with chronic health conditions, so things like POTS, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, Crohn's disease, diabetes, epilepsy. And many of my clients have multiple co-occurring conditions. I often work alongside independent college consultants like Eric and his team, or a student's high school counselor, because the sort of expertise that I bring is knowledge and awareness of the disability support process from the college side. My background is in higher ed. I was the associate director of the disability support office at Georgetown University. And so now I work primarily with students as they're engaging in the college search to think about their accommodation needs and to make sure that they are thinking about things holistically. Um, and I have some online courses and some other resources too, so you can always connect with me to get more information on those things. Thanks.
Thanks, Annie. And Annie really does unique work. If you work with or are supporting students with physical or medical conditions, I encourage you to check out her resources and connect with her. Mike.
Hi, everybody. My name is Mike Barnes. I'm the Vice President of Outreach and Admissions for College Living Experience. If you're not familiar with College Living Experience, we are a program that helps students with executive functioning, life skills, social skills, financial skills, high independent living. Um, our students mostly attend college. Some are on the career pathway. We have them in apartments that are very close to our centers, that are in and around all the universities and colleges that are in our areas. We have 8 different locations. Our students live in real world integrated living. So what I really, really enjoy about it is the students live in traditional housing by design. They are with traditional college students. They're in the same apartments. We have an RA that actually lives in the apartments that helps to support them if any needs come up. So it's true independent living, and it's something I'm really, really passionate about. Um, my background starts as I was a special education student first, and then I kind of fell in love with it after that. So I ended up, I've been in higher education for the last 10 years, running disability support offices from community colleges up through my last role. I was the director of campus accessibility at Princeton University before I came over to CLE. So I'm really, really excited to meet with everybody and to have this conversation. And if you have any questions about CLE or about the work that we do, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Thanks. I've had the pleasure of touring some of the CLE locations. You've got some really nice housing, and I can vouch that some of your locations are really like right across the street from colleges
Yeah.
in Nashville, and I think Costa Mesa also, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
Great. And last but not least, Julie.
Hi, folks. Great to be here with you. My name is Dr. Julie Lopatcher, and I'm the founder and executive director of Rising Tide Educators. And so, what we do at Rising Tide is a little bit different from what Eric and his team and Annie and her team do, and even a little bit different from Mike. But we all approach our work with the same spirit. So, we're dedicated to preparing our students with disabilities to thrive in higher education and beyond. So, we're really, really interested in that transitionary time period. So we start with the skill building as early as we can. We like to get into schools around 10th grade, work with our 10th, 11th, and 12th graders so that we've started this transition to college long before that August timeline, which I'm starting to hear from parents now that haven't engaged with us and they're like, what do I do? Um, and so, as a nonprofit organization, there's no charge to students or families for our services. So, if your student is anywhere in this process and you just want to chat with us, please reach out. And Tracy, financial based on if you just want some support, that is the financial basis that we need. Like I said, we will never charge students or families for our fees because we know that there has already been a premium that your family has paid because every diagnosis comes with one, right? And we're even going to talk about that today because the documentation that we have to get in order to access our accommodations in college uh, most times requires an additional visit to a provider, and there's an additional cost there. So we don't want to pass any costs on to you. But excited to be here and excited for this conversation with these great folks.
Yeah, excited to collaborate with you again, Julie. And one resource I forgot to mention that the Top College Consultants is involved in is we co-manage a Facebook group for parents. I'm going to put the link into the chat. It has a long name, Parents of College-Bound Students with Learning Disabilities, ADHD, and ASD. If you're on Facebook, and I know some of the folks here probably in the group, found out about it from the group. If you're not in the group and you're on Facebook, by all means join. If you're not on Facebook, that's totally fine. But we now have 29,000 plus parents in the group, so it's a great place for parents to learn from each other about supports, to get support and resources from each other. So all of our panelists tonight have worked in colleges, so you are hearing firsthand from folks who know how things work in college. So let's start off with the most important thing that I think, and why are we having this conversation? Because things really change from high school to college. What is important for families to know about that change?
So many things, right?
Hmm.
I think last time we were talking about this, I think it's just that the most important thing is that shift. We're going from the lens of the IDEA law, which is all about your student being successful. So a lot of your students might be getting service, accommodations within their high school that don't even make it onto the IEP. because they're just like, it's a really supportive environment. And when we get into college, we're now operating under the Americans with Disability Act, which is really about access and non-discrimination. And so this idea of success is no longer the standard. It doesn't mean the schools can't get there, but that's not the starting point, right? The starting point is simply access.
Absolutely. And I think it becomes much more almost exclusively student driven. So I think a lot of students are so used to the plethora of supports that they have in high schools where they're getting checked in constantly. There's that check for understanding piece. It's in so many IEPs, and a lot of the conversations I always had when students were transitioning is a lot of that goes away. But the supports are there if you know where to find them and you know where to look for them. So I think it's really ensuring that we're working with our students on sort of what the environment looks like and how self-driven it is, and to practice those skills and to really make sure that when they're going in, they have the right contacts at the university or the college. They know where to go if they have certain questions, and they know where to go to get the supports, and that they're really, really dialed in with the specific disability office at that institution, and really, you know, I think a lot of the stigma over the years has been broken down about certain students or people joining the disability offices. Like one piece of that I'll share is that at Princeton, there's about 5,000 undergraduate students, and about 1,500 of those students are part of the disability office. And as we all know, if 1,500 of those are part of the disability office, there's probably another 5 to 10% that didn't disclose. Um, so really, helping students understand that it's something that the line share of their peers are in the same process and they're in the same boat, and it kind of breaks that stigma down a bit.
Building off what Mike just shared, the college process is really different in that it really relies on students to be great self-advocates and to self-disclose. So a lot of times parents and students will think, oh, if I just, I disclosed my disability in my application to the university, so that means I will automatically get accommodations. And that's not the case. If students want to receive accommodations in the college setting, they actually have to connect with the Disability Support Office, which likely has a different name than the one I just said. So it could be Student Disability Services, Accessibility Services, Academic Resources. Every college has a different name. If you just go to the college website and put in Disability Services, that will usually point you in the right direction. But the student has to connect with that office or check out the website to see what is the process for requesting accommodations at this institution, and then follow that process, which usually requires documentation and an interview and to engage in the interactive process. And then the student gets approved for accommodations. So, or not. And then there's a different process if that happens. But that is a little bit different than how things may have worked in the past when the student had an IEP or a 504 plan and that sort of followed them along the path. And so it's really important that students are starting to work on those self-advocacy skills and getting comfortable disclosing their disability and talking about what their needs and knowing what their needs are, understanding, how does my condition impact me and what types of accommodations might I be thinking about in the college setting. So I would say that's a really big change. And to build off something else that Mike said, he mentioned Princeton stats. Like nationally, we know that 21% of college students report having a disability. So those are the students who have gone to the Disability Support Office and requested accommodations. That's a huge number of students who are registered with disability support offices. And so there's probably even more students who qualify. And if you look at the IEP stats and how many students in a public school have an IEP or a 504 plan, there is a big drop off in students who are going on to college. They usually, a portion of those students don't request accommodations in college. And so there are some questions about like why that is. Um, is it knowledge and awareness, or is it the documentation piece? Is it stigma? So there's different sort of schools of thought on that, and maybe it's all of those things. But I think it's really important for folks to understand that there are a lot of students with disabilities who are going to college and receiving accommodations.
Great
And I think,
points. Yep. Were you going to say something, Julie?
can I just
Sure.
add one thing? Because Annie made me think about this. Um, In high school, oftentimes if we need something, we can go talk to our teacher because they know you have your IEP, and those adjustments can happen really quickly. And when Annie was describing that interactive process, it can take much longer, especially if you're a new student. And so the timing is important. So
Mhm.
if anyone is on this call right now and their student is going off to college this fall, if you haven't done so yet, do it tonight or tomorrow. You know, your initial application doesn't have to be perfect because there is a process, but we want them to have your student's name and to get this process started now.
Absolutely. That was going to be my next question, Julie. I was going to ask, when should this happen? Um, yeah, and typically, if you're a senior, you're going to college in the fall, you would have had to generally commit to a college by May 1st. So I say, and sometimes students are committing earlier, could be March, could be even earlier if it's early decision. Soon as you put down that deposit and you get your student ID number and your college email address, you can go ahead and get the wheels turning, right, folks? You feel free to correct me if I say anything wrong. Uh, and
That's
you
totally.
maybe ask some of the kinds of questions Annie was saying, like, what is your disability? How does it affect you? What accommodations do you need? Don't expect as a student to just show up and shove them a piece of paper and say, you guys figure it out. It may well be a dialogue. There may be a process certainly where you submit accommodation, documentation, but be prepared as students to be able to talk about, well, why do you need this accommodation? How is that related to your disability? So students having that self-understanding is really important. Go ahead, Annie.
Yeah, I mean, 100%, Eric, that is an important piece of the puzzle. And I would say I saw some pieces in the chat where people said that they were starting to go on tours and like starting to look into schools and look at the types of accommodations. And I just wanted to add that like, well, the accommodation process, the formalized accommodation process for incoming students, can start on May 1st once they commit to that school. Students and families can still research disability support offices and begin to understand the process that those different disability support offices have for requesting accommodations, the types of accommodations that are typically provided. Usually the disability support office website is a good place to start to see like what's on the website, what's not on the website. Because if you've seen one disability support office website, you've seen one disability support office website. Same with disability support offices. They're all a little bit different in how they operate and function. And I think families expect a standardized process sometimes across universities, and that is not the case. Even with documentation guidelines, different schools, colleges can determine their own documentation processes and guidelines. And so you might have some variation in the types of documentation that might be accepted in one place versus another school. So that's really important as you're starting to hone in on the schools that you're interested in and the student is looking at those things to start to look at the documentation guidelines to understand like the staff in the office and the services and supports that the office provides. So you can look at those those websites and even connect with those offices during the search process to ask questions and engage and to get more information about the types of accommodations. And, some of these offices, like the office that I was in many, many moons ago at Georgetown, is also an academic support office. So some colleges have their disability office also does academic support. Some colleges have separate academic services offices. Some colleges don't have an academic services office, but they might have a writing center and a tutoring program. So every college is a little bit different in the types of services that they provide. So it's really important that as you're looking at schools to sort of peel back the onion and look a little bit deeper and see what they have there to offer you and your student.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great point. And I think that really drives home the point to really asking all those questions as early as possible. I've worked for a bunch of disability support offices over the years, and they all vary dramatically. And I think as you go through and you're looking at schools, some are hyper restrictive. They're hyper restrictive with the amounts of accommodations they're giving out. They're hyper restrictive about, extra time, and some aren't. So I think it's really important to look at the specific institution and that disability office. And to Annie's point as well, when you're looking at staffing, there are so many schools there that have, big schools that might have one or two people in the disability office and not a big
Yeah.
staff. So you're looking at, okay, I've got all of these students funneling through two staff members. That could be a problem for some students and some families. So, the more research that you can do, and also around the idea of like what accommodations are offered and sort of how stringent they are in terms of those specific accommodations. What I always say to students is accommodations are, it's basically a toolbox worth of stuff, so you can either use it or don't use it, but we need to advocate early on to get as many accommodations as possible that support your student's disability, because you never know. I have students who come to my office all the time and say, well, I don't really think I need extra time, or I don't really think I need
Right.
this. But the disability and the documentation supports that accommodation. So really advocating, for having the student advocate for themselves that no, they want it, because if they, accommodations aren't retroactive. So the amount of conversations I've had with students in April, and they're saying, well, I have a disability, I have accommodations. Well, it doesn't help you in April.
Yeah.
It's something
Right.
that we needed to get dialed in, because they're not going to make it retroactive. So the more research that you can do, and I think that's, why some of these organizations like Annie Eric's and Julie's are so important, is that they have that institutional knowledge. They know what programs are going to be the best for your specific student, for your specific student's disability, and which ones might not be, right?
Yeah, and I
Great.
think part of that research can also be when you're on the tour, when you're touring schools, pop in. What do you see? How receptive are they? Are there students hanging out in the space? Like, because a website is great, it'll give you lots of information, but you want to go and engage with the folks if you can. So I encourage
Yes.
you to include that in your actual visits.
We were talking earlier about, applying early, but that's different from researching, which should take place even earlier during the college search process. When you're trying to figure out what colleges am I going to put on my list, I think a key part of that process can be looking at the disability services office, and if there's a support program, a learning support program, an autism support program, looking at those as well. They might be run out of disability services, they might be completely separate. I put a link in the chat to a blog post I wrote on questions to ask disability services. Because when I say this to families, they say, well, what am I supposed to ask when I go? So I created a
Yeah.
list of questions.
And
Many
Eric,
colleges, yep,
oh, I was just going to chime in and say
yep,
there's a question in the chat, and I think like it's important to sort of frame like the language that we're using here. So we
mhm.
keep saying disability, right?
Right, right.
Disability,
Yeah,
disability.
yeah.
And that comes from the language of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the ADA defines a person with a disability as a person with physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. Um, and so what sort of falls under the umbrella of disability could be a learning disability. It could be autism spectrum disorders, could be mental health conditions, eating disorders, chronic health conditions, physical disabilities, hearing impairments, visual impairments. So there's a lot of things that sort of fall under this big umbrella. But regardless of what condition or conditions your student has, they would follow this same process to investigate and request accommodations at whatever college they were interested in. The types of accommodations might vary based on the student's conditions and needs, right? So some students might be focusing more on like the academic accommodations piece of this, right? And some families are probably thinking about that. But there are also accommodations for housing, for dining, for transportation. And so it depends on what the student's condition is and what the needs are. But I just wanted to sort of frame that for everybody so that we're all on the same page about the language that we're using here.
Thank you. I think, often families come to us and they're focused on academic accommodations, which is what they're typically used to focusing on in high school. When you get to college, if you're living on campus, you have all those other pieces that you just touched on, which are great for folks to be aware of because they may have multiple diagnoses, not just a learning difference, but also food allergies or mobility issue or migraines or some other condition that impacts other aspects, not just the classroom. To your point about language, yes, we've been using the term disabilities. It's right in the title of the webinar. Uh, I'm neurodivergent myself, as are my own children. I don't think of being neurodivergent or having a learning difference as being, excuse me, I've been talking to students all day, as being inherently a disability. I see it, I'm neurodiversity affirming. I think that differences are to be celebrated. But yes, in college, and you folks can attest to this, that is the language that's used for legal reasons, because that's the federal law. I have loads more questions for you, but I want to check in with Jennifer. Jennifer Quinn, as I said earlier, is on Top College Consultants team, a valued member who does not just college admissions, but also executive function coaching and career counseling. Are there any questions that have come up, Jennifer, that you feel like we should tackle next before we go to other
I
questions we
think
had in mind?
I think not at the moment. I think we could keep going for a moment.
Okay. So we talked about, checking, doing your research early on. Families provide a sort of different kinds of feedback about this experience. Sometimes they say when they go on tours, they were so helpful. I've also heard families say they wouldn't meet with me at all. They say they'll only talk to enrolled students. So your experience in the college research process is also information. It may just be information that, hey, this college is serving tens of thousands of students and can't meet with every family that comes along. But again, if you research or connect with other families through the Facebook group, you can ask them, hey, I haven't been able to talk to disability services. Has anybody had a student in this college that could give us feedback about what their experience has been? So what are some of the biggest challenges that students encounter when making this transition and starting to pursue accommodations? We talked about how it's different. What about that presents a challenge for high school students?
I think, one of the things that I see a lot is, again, to not to harken back on it, but the level of support is so different. It's, you're not having people checking in on you constantly to make sure that things are being done, that you wake up in time for class, that you are going to tutoring, that you're doing all of these things. So, the earlier that we can have those conversations with students and really prepare them that there's a massive shift, right? There's a massive shift in accountability that they're going to face. And it's one of those things that I always say that accommodations, they're not designed to make things easier. They're designed to make things possible. So it's, when we're having that conversation, the student is able to do it. They're able, but that's why the accommodations piece is so important. When we're looking at it, I used to say this all the time. If accommodation is making something easier, it's not the right accommodation. If it's allowing you to meet the needs of your coursework and then it's good. And I think it's something that shift you see a lot, where it really can really hamper their experience. And if they're not really prepared for it, but then also, knowing what resources are available. And I think that's why it's so important to do your due diligence and do your research, because there are tons of schools out there that really will, stay on you, and they'll help make sure at every step that you're dialed in and your stuff's being turned in. And there are some that you may meet with that disability office once and you'll never see him again for 4 years, and it's really important to find the right program that fits those needs. But the preparedness for the shift is something that I see a lot.
We spend a lot of time talking with our students, Mike, about that exact thing. And we are shifting this conversation from helps to needs, right? Because I have seen institutions be like, deny an accommodation because a student says it will help them, rather than using the language of, no, I need this to be able to participate fully. And that seems like a little piece, but it's so important. I always share this with families when they're like, okay, I'm going to my therapist. What should I say? I always say, make sure there's nothing in their letter that says this will help them. Make sure in your documentation that this is a need that addresses a functional limitation. Some
Yeah.
schools will be great and be like, yeah, oh, that'll help you. Great, we can do it. Because again, like, Annie and Mike have mentioned, it's the wild, wild west out there. Some schools will take anything, and other schools will be like, oh, this provider has the same last name as you. I'm going to call and make sure you're not related. Right?
Yeah.
So, but making sure that students are able to speak to the accommodations that they need from a place of need and not a place of help. And that language right there can be really powerful, make their life easier.
Absolutely. And I think too, like it's, to that point, that last IEP meeting that they have their senior year is so vitally important to make sure that document is airtight. And to really, be able to go into that meeting and have those conversations of exactly how you want it to read, the vernacular, the legal language, and really working with students. And we used to do this all the time, but how, to your point, Julie, is how you're communicating your needs. You know, Sometimes you have to do it in a way that's almost in a legal kind of framework, right? You really have to make sure that the language that you're choosing, and to also, whenever possible, put it in writing. Follow up with an email. Here's exactly what what I asked, what I discussed, and make sure that that language is exactly what it needs to be. And then working with the child study team or your school counselor as you're developing that last IEP, because there are certain things that can be put in there that can really make the process 10 times easier.
And
I want to pick, yeah, go ahead, Eric.
not all colleges will accept the IEP as documentation.
No.
Colleges accept a range of documentations. That's another topic we can come back to in a second. But speaking of IEPs, on IEPs or students who are on IEPs are often getting services, supports, accommodations, modifications, and that's all thrown together in that one document. And when a student shows up in high school, all of that stuff happens, and the teachers and the staff don't say, okay, what I'm about to do now is a modification and this is an accommodation. It just all happens, hopefully seamlessly. When students go to college, it's a very different story. Does anyone want to talk about what's different from that account, from that standpoint, in terms of what you can get in college?
I can chime in. So
Yeah.
colleges aren't required to provide services or modifications. Students with disabilities, just like any other student, have to meet the same curricular goals as their peers. And so I think that is something that catches a lot of families off guard. So if your student has a service, and a service that might be included in an IEP is a thing like speech and language services and supports, or it could be tutoring center supports, or it might be a one-on-one aid. So colleges don't provide those types of services. And in terms of modifications, some students might have like a sort of reduced homework load, so they have to do fewer questions or things like that. And colleges don't provide that as an accommodation. An individual student could go up to their professor and say, hey, if I can show you in 5 answers what everybody else has to do in 10, like, will you accept that? And the professor could say yes or no. But that is not a typical college accommodation. That's a modification, and students have to, meet the same goals as their peers. Something that you said, Eric, that I think is really important, and there was a question that just sort of came up in the chat too that is about this. Um, Colleges don't have to accept IEPs or 504 plans as source documentation, as primary documentation. They might want to look at it for historic sort of documentation to give them more background on what sorts of accommodations that the student had received in the past. There are a few states now where IEPs can be used in the state school system, in the university system, as documentation. I know Virginia is one of those states, and I feel like Arizona, but don't quote me on that. And there's a couple others that are speckled in. There's a piece of legislation called the RISE Act. That is a federal legislation that people have been trying to work on to allow IEPs to follow a student to college. They've been working on that for 10 plus years now. So So colleges can still determine what they want to have as documentation. Someone had asked about like if my kid is in a private school setting and they don't have an IEP or a 504 plan, what do we need to have in place? So first, like your student doesn't have to have had formalized accommodations in high school to then be able to request them in college. So if your student didn't have an accommodation plan or an academic plan or any sorts of accommodations, um, the student can get primary source documentation. So if it's a learning disability, that might be a neuropsych evaluation. If it's a chronic health condition like POTS or Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, or a mental health condition, or um, another type of condition, usually the disability support office will want a letter from your healthcare provider that outlines your condition, the functional limitations, how it impacts the student, the types of accommodations that the student might need. And so every college has these documentation guidelines that you can look at to see what does this college require. So that's important, I think, to know sort of going into this process.
And I think if I can add to that, I like the IEP because it can do a couple things for you, right? Annie did a great job of really highlighting how not everything is transferable. So I'm often talking with families about, okay, paint me the entire picture of all the supports and adjustments that your student uses and will use, and those are often listed in the IEP. And that can help in the college search, right? It helps you zoom out and see, oh, my student really benefited from tutoring. Look at how robust the tutoring is at this particular school, whereas at this one, so it can be a great tool in that capacity. If that is the only documentation that you have, I have seen students get temporary or provisional accommodations from their
Yeah.
college by providing the IEP and saying, hey, here's demonstration that I needed this help and I am working that. Maybe I just moved out of state. We see students that come out of the foster care system that it's hard for them to carry with them all their documentation. So the IEP can be a valuable piece in terms of getting something temporarily or provisionally in place for them in college or university while they go and reestablish that provider connection.
Thanks. Jennifer, anything in the chat we should know about?
Yes, I think we have a couple of questions. So there's a couple that are specifically about this, and then there's another question from Stephanie Oshman about what kinds of questions should they ask when visiting to understand how robust the accommodations are. So I would like to talk maybe about the difference between accommodations versus extra support services and what is considered standard versus maybe extra things. So that we'll do that one second. But the first one, Beth Mansfield Griswold asked, one of her students is going to college soon. He has ADHD and he's on the autism spectrum. The mom does not want him to push for accommodations in college. She thinks that the extended time he got in high school enabled his procrastination. And she thinks that if he has extended time in college, he's not going to meet the deadlines. So I did write my own opinion in the chat, but I thought I would open this up to the panel so you guys can all answer this as well.
I love this one.
So do
I love this one. So we're seeing a shift now. So mom, don't be worried because we are seeing a shift amongst students that have ADHD are not nearly getting the extensions on assignments that they used to get. Right? Institutions are saying ADHD, you have ADHD every single day. I have ADHD. I wish I woke up some mornings without it. Not the case. So what are they're responding with, you know what? You can do a reduced course load.
Yeah.
That reduces the number of deadlines for your student to have to meet. So I think that's my opinion. I'd love to hear what Mike and Annie have to say, but I think with the extended time on assignments for ADHD, I think that procrastination piece is less of it. But he's going to want the extra time on those tests.
Well, I made a distinction that the extended time is not actually what's creating the procrastination, it's the ADHD. And so if the student needs extra time on a test to demonstrate what they know, not necessarily on an assignment, right? Maybe they have slow processing or they don't read as quickly, right? Then maybe you do want that because that would level the playing field, especially, if you have to take a final exam, maybe you don't need it for a quiz, but so I just wanted to add that to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think too, like one of the things that, that I think about a lot in these situations is how much we've spoken with the parent and the student together. I've seen a lot of instances where parents can kind of, have the best intentions, but project a little bit of their own ideals and their own thoughts about, how their student operates. And I think it's one of those things that really, you know, it's something that, and I get the sentiment that the parent has, but like you said, Julie, colleges are starting to really pull back on really just giving that out, and I think that's why picking a disability office is the right disability office is so important. Like I know when I was at the University of Delaware, for instance, we would track that. We would track how often students were using certain accommodations and how effective they were, and really running data based on how that grade was affected based on the or if a student is using extra time and they're in the testing center, working with the testing center and saying, hey, like is this student using all of their time? Are they, what are they, how are they acting when they are taking the exam, when they're doing the certain things? And it gives you that piece of data. Like if they're there just kind of looking around and then still waiting till the last minute, which I have ADHD as well, and that's sort of my MO, is to wait around to the last minute until I feel like the world's about to light itself on fire, and then I start doing the work. But when we have those types of data points, it's good. And what we don't want to do is have the student wait until they're at that point of no return, and then they're getting to finals time and they're going, well, I really need this, and then you're in a whole heap of stuff because everybody's backed up and you've got all these sort of different things going on. I mean, it's accommodations exist for a reason, and with an autism ADHD diagnosis, the extra time is something that is probably one of the most, if not the most, um, useful accommodations that sort of make that process a little bit easier. So I think, reframing it with the family in that sense, I think is something that's really just really, really important, and really getting to the the meat of the why, and what data do we have that supports the decision, whether that's coming from the high school, whether that's coming from, outside therapist, where, I would really try to bring in other providers to really, to get a clearer picture on why this accommodation would not be effective based on a specific disability.
Um, Everybody else did a great job of focusing in on the sort of distinction between extensions on assignments and extended time on tests and all of these pieces and how to parse through these things. I wanted to take a minute and just say that like the other piece of this puzzle is honing in on like the students' executive function skills. Something that's very different from college and high school is that like you get a syllabus at the beginning of the semester. It has all the deadlines and the dates and the things that you'll need to do to meet the benchmarks and requirements along the way. So that could be a little bit different from what the student had experienced in the past and allow them to do a little bit more planning and have more touch points so that they can make sure that they're staying on track with their work and things like that. So the executive function skills piece is an important piece of this puzzle. And irregardless of like whether the student has autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, or a chronic health condition that has unpredictable flare-ups, like having accommodations in place from the beginning is the smartest move because they're not retroactive. So if a student comes in October and they're like, I need extensions on assignments, then it might take, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks until that could get into place. And the other thing is that like, it's like insurance, right? So you're happy you have it in place when you need it. Nobody makes the student use the accommodation. So the student will have to choose like, do I want to talk to my professor about utilizing this accommodation for an extension? Um, and they may choose not to, and so, or they may forget to, and then they will, the situation will play out as it is. And so I think that to that parent, I would explain those sort of scenarios and just indicate that it is better to have it in place, and then the student will have to determine whether or not they actually utilize the accommodation.
You mentioned the syllabus, Annie. I think it's a double-edged sword in college. So the downside is in high school, if you're used to having your teachers say, hey, remember there's a quiz tomorrow, remember the paper's due next week. College professors don't have to do that because they have given you the syllabus at the beginning of the term, and it's on you, the student, to remember when those benchmarks are. But as you pointed out, the flip side is that you've got that and you can now plan out your term. If you are a student who is not really good at doing that, you can bring somebody into the picture to help you with that, like an executive function coach or learning specialist or someone who can say, okay, great, we've got all this information. Let's connect your calendar to these assignments. Um, there's also a bigger picture of, we're all talking about the system as it is under the laws that exist. We're not saying this is the best possible system or the best possible
Right.
world. I would love to see universal design for learning where the burden isn't on the student to make all of these, to have to do all the self-advocacy. But this is the system we're working with. I talked to a professor in Arizona when I was out there presenting at an event who said, my students don't have to ask for extra time. All my students get all the time they need.
Mm.
That's universal design. So we don't have to get into the individual accommodations, but that's the exception. Hopefully
Right.
that's the future, but for now we're talking about the system as it is. Jennifer, I know you said there were some other things, or did you want to say
And
something,
can
Julie?
I add one little
Yeah,
thing to
sure.
that?
Go ahead.
And this, I think we've said it now multiple times. Get the accommodation set up early. Just get them early. Students, I think it's really common. And those of us that have worked with students coming out of high school that maybe didn't have a great experience in their version of special ed, they say, I want to do it independently. I always say, great, let's do it independently, but let's set up the scaffold of support that's right there. Because also the reality is your student will not need the accommodations in every class, right? Like Eric's example was perfect. Some professors are you know, going to be so supportive and build a classroom environment that is highly inclusive, so it's less needed. Some students, are students with autism, are students with ADHD that can hyper focus. If they love a class, they might not need, right? So there are a number of scenarios, and so getting them set up doesn't mean every class is going to look exactly the same.
Yeah.
Jennifer, were there some other questions you think that we should
Yes.
follow up on?
There's one more. Sarah Bass says, I see quite a few parents who want to pursue accommodations late in the senior year in order for a 504 documentation or something like that to show the college. Often the students haven't had any accommodations throughout high school. Thoughts about this?
I just want to say something quick and then I'll let you folks jump in. I've seen questions like that in the Facebook group too, like, can my student get accommodations in college if they haven't been on a 504 IEP? Of course, a disability can strike at any time. Your student may not have gotten a diagnosis until after they graduated from high school. So the 504 IEP might be a useful foundation, but is absolutely not required. And I'll shut up and let other folks jump in.
Well, and to your point, Eric, a lot of our students are incredibly capable and they've developed these workarounds. So they don't realize until they get to college and they're met with the volume, the increased volume, the pace, and the expectation of independent learning, that really the symptomology of maybe a learning disability or an ADHD really becomes a barrier. So yeah, it's okay.
I'm not sure if the question was sort of like leading towards like people who are doing this duplicitously to get accommodations, like even if they don't need them. That is, I mean, that's sort of maybe that's a question for the person who asked the question. But like there might be circumstances where, yeah, something is more emergent, and a student needs to get documentation or to sort of figure out what accommodations might be useful to them. And sometimes that includes like having a full neuropsych evaluation, even if you've never had one before. And the everything related to disabilities is case by case, right? And we don't know, what someone else is experiencing at any one point, right? So sometimes the timing just happens that way. So yeah, I think from a college perspective, having a history of accommodations is nice. It shows the Disability Support Office like what had happened in the past, but it's not always essential to see that history of accommodations, to receive accommodations, in the college setting. So that's important for folks to know.
Yeah, I mean, I think colleges, I mean, it can definitely set off some red flags with colleges. I've seen that happen before where, if you get there, if there isn't a long history disability, it may prompt a few more questions. It may prompt, asking for additional documentation and things like that. But like Eric said, a disability can present at any time. And to harken back to what Julie said too, is it, and I was one of those students where I figured out coping mechanisms and strategies to figure it out, and then, you get to college and you're like, okay, none of these work anymore. And we see it all the time, right? And, I think and again, to keep coming back to it, that's why the decision of the institution is so important. Some colleges, they'll take an IEP or 504. And it's all good, and let's just roll with it. But we need to, especially in an instance like this, knowing, knowing the way that office operates and the way that they approve accommodations is so important. Um, because then too, you've run into with a lot of students, you run into a question about resources. Like, when I was working at the community college and we would have students come in before I took it over, and they would come in and they would have just an IEP or 504. They would have no psych eval, no psych ed, and the institution was saying, "Well, this is great, but we want a full diagnosis, all this stuff." And a lot of these families, they don't have resources for that, So it's working with an institution. I was thankful to work and run institutions that felt this way, but you can glean a lot from an IEP, a 504, and a conversation, and it's for some institutions like the ones that I worked at, it's just not that deep, right? Like we can figure it out, we can get some things in place, and we can ensure that the student has access. Some are highly restrictive and highly stringent. And I'm not saying one is better than the other, but we have to have that understanding of what the student is getting themselves into, and also what might be required of them, if they do get in with just that 504 or with just that IEP that came in at the end of their senior year.
I've seen questions in the chat about neuropsych evaluations, and I just want to underscore that neuropsych evaluations aren't relevant to all students with disabilities. If a student's
No.
disability is a mobility impairment or some chronic medical condition, it may have nothing to do with a learning difference or require a neuropsych evaluation. It might be a doctor's letter in that case. And
But
yeah.
sorry, Eric, go.
Sure.
I
Yeah,
did
I
not mean to
think
interrupt you.
Mike sort of alluded to this earlier, and I think more than one of you touched on this. That colleges vary. So I have talked to disability staff at colleges who say, we will work with whatever you bring us. If it's a doctor's letter, if it's a 5-year-old neuropsych, whatever you got, bring it in, we'll make it work. Other colleges you can see right on the website, it must be a neuropsych within the past 3 years, and
Right.
it has to have these tests included it's very specific. And to your point, Mike, that is tricky, given that those can cost thousands of dollars, and there could be several months wait in your particular area. So we work with families to figure this out. I know providers who are less expensive. There are a handful of colleges that provide students with access to low cost evaluations, but it's a tricky landscape sometimes. Go ahead, Julie.
And I think one of the ways to navigate that has been successful at some universities, always check out your disability, any schools you're looking at, because they will have some of them now, a lot of them now have a provider form. And they don't even want just a standard letter from your provider. They want a form filled out by them. Um, and this is great because I've seen it successful in where a student had maybe their ed psych or their neuropsych 5 years ago, and they don't have access to that person anymore, but they've had a long-term therapeutic relationship. And so that provider can fill out the form and say, hey, I've known and been working with this student since they got diagnosed. And so sometimes the combination of the documentation that you collect along the way can create the entire picture that they're looking for. So utilize everyone that you have. Utilize all your providers.
Do we have a last question or in the chat, or a last topic that you
I
folks think we
think
haven't
that
touched on yet?
I think that we have answered most of the questions in the chat.
And panelists, is there something that wasn't asked that you think families really need to know? Uh, it's a big topic. I didn't get to all the questions that I have. One question is what's changing? I did a whole other panel, which discussion, which you can find on our YouTube channel, about what's changing in the world of disabilities. Is there anything that you feel folks need to know that's going on right now? Um,
Mm.
I'll
There
see a
was a
question about
question. Yeah.
FERPA.
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 Yeah, let's
Yeah,
do that real
go
quick because
ahead.
that's a good
Yeah.
one.
Tackle.
That's a good one.
So I'll just chime in and say when a student turns 18 or signs the dotted line and commits to a college, um, all of the communication from the college goes to the student, and parents are usually caught off guard by this. So if the student wants the parent to have access to their grades, their educational record, to be able to connect with offices, the student and the parent will need to sign a FERPA waiver. So the student can usually access that through the registrar's office, where they can ask the folks at the university how to get a FERPA waiver. And then the parent and the student will both have to sign that waiver to allow the parent to have access to those things. And the other thing is like individual offices at that institution might have a different process. So the Disability Support Office might want something different in addition to the FERPA waiver if a parent wants to be a part of a meeting or a guardian wants to be present. So the thing that I would say is like super important is that like the student will have to be prepared to take the lead on all of these pieces. And that doesn't mean that the parent can't be a supportive partner, a guardian can't be a supportive partner, but the student is going to be doing the outreach. The student should be leading the conversations. The student should be the one who's sort of reaching out and connecting all of these pieces with the guardian and the parent maybe assisting or supporting in the back. Other thoughts, Julie? I see you nodding
Well,
feverishly.
to prepare families for this, I have students sign a FERPA waiver when they work with us, right? And the idea is that students are now taking the lead in terms of the communication, and it's really good to have students and parents come together to talk about what information they can expect the student to share, how often, because a lot of parents can call the school and be like, hey, how did Jennifer do today? Oh, I can see her right now. She's having a drink of water. She's doing great, right? That is some of the access that parents have that going to college, even if you've signed the FERPA waiver, you could call the department, but they might have their own way in which they store that FERPA information. So even though you and your student have signed that waiver, you could call. And I've been to a lot of FERPA trainings. I can neither confirm nor deny the presence of that student at this institution.
Yeah.
And I got to tell you, parents, you don't like hearing that. So communicating early with your student about what we're going to share, how often can be a great sort of way to build that autonomy and agency within your student and ensure that parents, you're a part of this as well. But we've shifted to the independence that we're going for in higher ed.
Yeah, without that communication, things can go way off track without a parent being the wiser, unfortunately. But
Yep.
yeah, I hate to end on a bad note. Thank you so much, panelists. This has been a fantastic discussion with Accessible College, Rising Tide Educators, and CLE, or the College Living Experience. Thanks also, Jennifer, for monitoring the chat. And thank you to our audience for your great questions and for joining in. Hope to see you at future events.
Thank you so much.